All right, good morning, everybody. Well, let's get started. Everyone's mics and videos are probably turned off, and you won't be allowed to unmute for this. If you have a question, please share it in the chat room. And can someone respond in the chat room to let me know that you can hear me okay? All right, very good. Thank you for responding. All right, so I'm sure everyone can now see the Martus screen I have up. What we're going to work on today is what it looks like to propose a fiscal year 25 budget, and we'll do that from a couple of different perspectives. So for anyone using Martus, when we go into Martus, we're going to go into Planner. All our change requests are budget modifications. We're used to going to change requests. That's not where we're going to go today. We're working on our proposals for fiscal year 25. So we're going to go into Worksheets. And your view might be different than mine. Just depends on whatever access you're using. I am using a test account. So I've got a test funding source and checkbook, or a test program and checkbook sitting up here. And in Martus, that's what a worksheet is the combination of your program and your checkbook. So we don't see the funding sources out on this screen. We're going to see them inside of the worksheet. When we first log in, what we're going to see is that the fiscal year up here says fiscal year 2024, and that should be standard for everyone logging in and navigating here for the first time. So the very first thing we want to do is change that year from 2024 to 2025, and we're going to click the blue load button. Once that loads, we'll see 2025 here, but the budget name is going to change, and it's going to say Drafts FY 2025. That's how we know we're in the right area. You can use the program funding source checkbook filters if you want to eliminate other worksheets that are visible on your screen. Otherwise, if we're ready to go, we can click on the pencil here to begin working on the fiscal year 25 budget. If we haven't taken any action yet, we haven't added any lines, we haven't loaded any previous year budgets, we're going to come to a screen that looks like this. There's no budget worksheet yet. So the first thing we're going to look at doing is how we manually add account lines. So on screen, we'll have a menu that says Line Actions. And we have Add Line. And from here, we can begin choosing our accounts and budgeting appropriately. So if we had a copy machine lease, say, we can click inside the account drop box to get that down. And now we can begin typing whatever it is that we're looking for. If we're not sure of the number, so I start typing lease, I might come across a lot of lease account numbers. But the one we're using for copy machine leases or building leases, land leases, vehicle, or just any kind of equipment is this account number here, 73140. The second thing we have to do is add our funding source. So depending on your access, your list could be pretty long. And so as I start typing, it's going to match what I'm doing, and I have a budget here. So test.25 is my funding source, and I can add the line. And so what we see on screen right now is just the one line, the funding source, no budgetary information yet. We can now add budget one of two ways. We can click into the fields. It opens up the area that we can start working inside of. And we can type in whatever we think we're spending for a lease. I might hit X on this one because I'm going to use the calculator. The other option is to hit this calculator. and it lets us work with what we're doing here. So if I got a copy machine lease, I probably have a copy of the lease terms. More than likely I'm making a monthly payment. So I'm gonna change the adjustment type to monthly. And let's say it's a $400 a month copy machine lease. If I hit preview, it's gonna fill that in all of the months and then the subtotal. And gives you a little reminder here to click preview before you click save. So now we have those things populated. I click save. Martus refreshes, and now there's our budget. If we have a copy machine lease, we probably have paper or the types of office supplies. So we're going to repeat those actions again. If we don't know the number, start typing the words of the account names. You'll find what's appropriate. So now we have office supplies. And then we need to select a funding source. One thing to be sure of here is adding manually, you have to pick the funding source every time. It's not going to remember. So if I click add line without selecting a funding source, there's going to be a blank spot here. And if I don't recognize or see that that mistake's been made, we go through the rest of the process and we save our budget. Later, that's going to prevent Martus from syncing this information to Intact, not just for your proposal, but everybody's proposals. So be really careful about that funding source place being blank. When you come through here, and maybe we're going to spend $1,500 this year on office supplies. So we've got that in there. Once you enter a number, if we're doing it this way, as soon as you're done, you have to hit the green save button at the end. If you don't hit the save button, it's not going to save any of the information you're manually adding. If we use the calculator, there's the blue save button, which works the same way. But it's saving our entries. Otherwise, if we leave and then come back in, that's not going to be there. And we're probably going to be trying to convince someone we've entered it, it's Martus's fault. It's likely something we've done. So we have our office supplies, we have our equipment leases account, and maybe our program is a one-person department. And if we've looked at the memo that went out in April, it gives us some information about what we should be looking to budget now that we're going to have a one-person staff that we need to budget for. So we're going to go back to adding a line, and the first thing we're going to do is budget our wages for the employee. And let's say we know that on a gross basis, the employee is earning $2,000 a pay period. So now I've changed the adjustment type to biweekly instead. I've got $2,000 every 2 weeks. And if I click preview, it'll fill that in. So we can see in fiscal year 24 when we're likely to have 3 pay periods. So December and June. And then we click save. So now we have our gross payroll in for an employee. One of the items listed in the memo that went out is to make sure we budget for 2 cash awards. Great, so that'll be our next step. So we use employee recognition, find our funding source. Now we can add that line. And let's assume that'll be $1,000. That'll be 2 $500 awards this year paid. So I'll enter that in manually here and click the green save button once I'm finished with this line to make sure that that line saves for our budget proposal. The memo also says to project your cost of living adjustment at 2.5%. Well, we didn't do that here at the top, so now let's make that adjustment for the 2.5% cost of living adjustment. We can click on this calculator. one of the options here is to adjust. And we want an adjustment of 102.5%, meaning the full amount of the $4,000 plus 2.5. If I click preview, there's the adjustment on what the effect of that 2.5% cost of living adjustment is. It's now we went from $52,000 to $53,300 as our gross payroll. Next, the memo tells us that payroll taxes is about 17%. We're going to go to line actions, add line, find our payroll taxes. Select our funding source. Now we can add that line. If we want to use the calculator, we got to do 2 steps here. So we can see the gross payroll is roughly $54,300. So if I do the taxes and just punch in $54,300, that allows us to get that number in there, and we can bring up the calculator one more time. And now we'll do an adjustment. We don't want 117%, we want 17% of that value. So now there's our estimated taxes for the employee. Next on that list is life insurance. So we'll select the account number and the funding source. Life insurance on the last memo says $13.80 a month. So I'm going to use the monthly calculator, punch in $13.80, click preview, and there it is, and save. And that's just for a single employee. So if we have more employees than that, we can multiply the $13.80 and do the same monthly calculation. We have vision and dental we need to work on. On that last memo, it says $23.91 a month. I don't know if that's changed, but we'll go by that memo. We have monthly, $23.91. We hit preview, so it fills in. We see what that looks like. Now we can save. And the last item is health insurance. Something to keep in mind when budgeting health insurance is you may see 2 lines for health insurance. One says program, one says fringe health insurance. If you're participating in the tribe's health insurance plans, you will select fringe health insurance. Now the memo does say it's $19.55 a month, but my understanding is there's been an approval for a different health insurance plan, which costs somewhere in the neighborhood of about $630 a month per employee. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go to the calculator. We're going to go to monthly. We're going to go to amount. Preview that and have that all the way down. And then we can click save. And if we're a grant program, contract program, a revenue generating program, we have one more step to make. So if this was my entire budget as terms of expenses, I should have a matching amount of revenue from a grant, from a contract, from our revenue. And so for this exercise, this will be a grant program. So we'll find the federal grant line, our account, our funding source. And let's just say this amount is the amount of our award. So now we have revenue for the year, our expenses budgeted for the year. Our revenue total 77,000, our expenses total 77,000. And down here there's no difference, so we know we've budgeted equal amounts of revenue, equal amounts of expenses. From here, the memo asks that we provide budget justification, future program needs, and then any supporting documentation for like revenue sources, matching requirements, date of contracts, grant periods. If we have all of that, in the past, Martus only allowed one attachment at a time. We can add multiple attachments now, as you can see from the examples I added earlier. And so we can just hit browse, find it on your desktop, and then upload that attachment. So it does support multiple attachments now. Once we're finished, all of the budget information is saved. There's no further action for you to take. Up here on Worksheet Actions, there's a Submit and Lock button. Please don't use that. We don't want the worksheet to be locked, because if you need to make changes later, if you lock it, you won't have access to it, and you're going to have to wait for Lynette or Daryl to unlock the worksheet for you. And if you're doing that in the evenings or weekends, they might not be available at beck and call. Leave it unlocked. Just save each line as we're going through and make that adjustment. Now, earlier we forgot to enter a funding source for a line item. If that happens, in the past, we might have had to delete the line and then add it again. We don't have to do that anymore. So at the end of the line, there is a checkbox. And at line actions, where there's add line, there's also change dimension. Now we can select a proper funding source, select change when we're ready, and then now that fills in. There's no save that has to be done that saves through that process. And so now we'd have a complete submission or proposal ready to go for Lynette to gather for budget and finance and eventually for council. One that you'd be able to see. And as these are synced several times a week into Intact, those will be visible in Intact as well. All right. So let me look to see if we have any questions in the chat room. Okay, no questions. So we're going to look very quickly at the next thing. I'm going to delete all of my budget lines here. And we're going to look at a second way we could add budget if we had a prior year budget information. So I've got all the lines selected and I'm going to hit delete lines. If you have a budget from the previous year, once we get to this page like this, we can click load and it'll upload the previous year's information. Now we've only used load, so it's only bringing forward account numbers and funding sources. So if you notice now, the funding sources here say test.24. If we have a new funding source that starts, now it's test.25. So maybe the first thing we want to do is change that funding source. I'm going to select all of those lines. And just like the example I showed with the blank funding source, we can go to line actions, change dimensions. Here we are we want that to update to test 25 instead of using test 24. Now all those funding sources are changed and we can begin working on our budget if it's changed from the grant. Optionally, let's delete this and go through it one more time. If we're loading that prior year information and we want the budget, I don't remember if I added a budget for these, but we'll find out. you can hit initialize. And do you want to use the actual numbers from 2024 or the budgetary numbers? So let's use budget. Do we want 100%, meaning the full value of what was budgeted? Inflation is at 3.5% right now. So maybe at a minimum, we're going to add 3.5% to our initializing, and we hit set values. It'll bring over the budget from the previous year and add 3.5%. Then if we need to change the funding source, change the funding source. If I hit show reference detail, here is the 24 information. So we can see the revenue budget was $54,000 in fiscal year 24. We use that as our basis for the 2025 budget, but we added that 3.5%, so it increased a little bit. And then the expense accounts did the same thing. All right. Anybody have any questions? Put them in the chat box if you do. We'll wait a moment. Otherwise, this is all I've had, so everyone can get back to their regular part of the day. We have a question. If a program has more than one funding source, will they all load? Yes. Whatever we're adding from here through load, all of them will be imported into the new fiscal year. If they're for some budgets or funding sources we're not using, we can delete those. You could use the filter on the funding source to just show just the one funding source you want to see, and then use the check boxes to select line actions, delete, or change. And we have another question. Will the video be available for reference to help? We'll see what that looks like. I haven't used the Google Meet before for recording, so we'll see if that comes out. And if it does, I'll make sure and email those of you that were here. All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a good rest of your day.